Muscular anatomy is always a challenge for so many people who want to go from fitness enthusiast to personal trainer to knowledgeable trainer and coach. But it's an important one. You're going to be working with people in the gym. You need to be able to look at the human body and to be able to pull away their skin with your eyes and be able to see where things are. So in this video, that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to take you guys through the most important lower body muscles that you need to know. We're not physical therapists, but we do need to have a good understanding of how does my position affect this exercise and what muscles am I targeting. So we're gonna jump in, and thankfully for you guys, I found some pretty cool software to try to bring it to life, because chances are if you're watching this video, you're probably a visual learner. I'm definitely the same way. If I can see it, I can start to connect the dots, and then I can feel it, it's much easier to learn. But let's go ahead and dive in. And you guys will see here on my screen, I've got my friend, we're gonna call him Jim today, or whatever else you wanna name our little muscular anatomy superhero here. And again, for me, just the ability to see where muscles start and end is so powerful. And as we start to take a look, even just initially at the lower body, let's just appreciate how complex the human system is. There are so many muscles wrapping in different positions and angles around the entire body. Now, as I mentioned, the good thing for you is we don't have to learn all of them. That might be too much for us right now. But the lower leg especially, as we start from the ground and we're gonna work our way up, and I'm gonna show you guys some things on the screen, and then I'm gonna step away and try to take you guys through some exercises and actions as well, because I want you guys to be able to use this stuff to also problem solve. I want you to be able to see the muscle, but then also think about, okay, what exercises, what joint actions is this muscle involved in? So we're gonna go first to what we call the posterior side. And just to connect that with what you guys have already been learning or probably going to learn, posterior means the back side of the body. And this is probably gonna start with a more familiar muscle group for you guys. This first one, you can see somewhat of this heart-shaped or teardrop-shaped muscle on the back of the lower leg, your gastrocnemius. Also sometimes talked about as the gastroc. This is one of the most important muscles below the knee that we're gonna talk about. Also referred to as one of your calf muscles, which there are two of. But the gastrocnemius, this is gonna be that larger, more superficial, right? The one you see when someone's got some well-defined calves. So if you were to watch someone doing calf raises in the gym and they're going up and down and you see the muscle that's on the exterior of the body, that's gonna be your gastroc. So as we start to try to connect some of this stuff, you guys can see the gastroc is an interesting muscle because it starts, as we zoom in, above the knee. So we think about it as moving the ankle, and we'll talk about the motion for that, and it does, but it's a unique muscle in that it crosses over multiple joints. So as you guys are going through this process, thankfully, you're not in an anatomy class. It's not like for me back in college where I had to memorize the exact anatomical origin of that muscle and exactly where it started. But what you do want to know is you want to be able to visualize where does it start and where does it end? Because as we keep working our way through these muscular anatomy videos, I'll keep going back to the fact that if you know where it starts and you know where it ends, it can only shorten and lengthen. So you know what it does. And so I'm not worried that you guys memorize the origin of the insertion, right? We see on here, you know, the origin, the lateral condyle and lateral supracondylar line of the femur. I can't even say it. But that piece doesn't matter for you. But we do want to know, hey, guess what? This actually crosses over the knee. All right, it crosses over the knee. And then you can see those fibers come down and they actually kind of start to turn into this white tissue. This is called our calcaneal tendon. Some people will call this your Achilles tendon, but this is going to be that connective tissue that goes down into our calcaneus. So if we step away, let's just think about the actual gastroc and what it does. We know that it aids in calf raises, but what's that actual motion called? You know, if you guys are in the process of your studying, you probably know plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. If not, you guys are learning it now. But when we go up into a calf raise, we go into what's called plantar flexion. And that motion is happening at the ankle. Your gastroc is a huge driver of that motion, right? Interestingly enough, your gastroc is actually a fast twitch muscle fiber as well. So when we start thinking about big, strong, powerful motions, running, sprinting, skipping, hopping, this is gonna be a big player, right? Your gastroc is gonna be a big driver of that. Now, interesting, we talked about the fact that it also crosses behind the knee. So it is gonna be what we call a prime mover at the ankles, but it may also be somewhat synergistic in knee flexion, meaning that the calf actually can work a little bit. And this one's not uncommon. You might have been doing maybe some hamstring curls at some point in time and felt a little bit of your calf firing up. And that's why, right? That's why. Sometimes if people have really tight or restricted calves, that may be more common. But it does cross over the knee. Now, when it comes to our muscles, it's all about mechanical lines of pull. Like, where do I have a mechanical advantage? So one thing that you want to keep in mind with the gastroc, because we'll get into our soleus next, is that when we are in more of a straight leg standing position, our gastroc is in a really great mechanical advantage, right? It's super strong based upon the lever setup and system. But as we start to take a look at muscle number 2, right? So we've got our gastroc, the gastrocnemius, and if we pull that thing away, we can actually start to take a look at the soleus, which is our second muscle. So we've got the gastroc, which sits on more of the outside, right? It's that teardrop portion of the calf. And then the soleus sits kind of right underneath of it, all right? And the unique thing that we'll see about the soleus is if we look at where it starts, this is the major difference. It does not cross over the knee, right? So it's actually going to start below the knee, which means it can't be involved in any motions, right? I mentioned before, if we think about where a muscle starts and where it ends, we know what it does. Well, since this muscle starts below the knee joint, that means it can't have any type of mechanical pull on the knee. So while the gastroc can be involved in flexion at the knee, the soleus is not at all. It's only going to work at the ankle. And you can see it actually goes down and kind of turns into the similar connective tissue down into that calcaneal tendon. So that being said, the soleus is also still going to be involved in plantar flexion. Now, one of the differentiators between your soleus and your gastroc, as we look even on the images at these two sides, is your soleus is going to be more of a slow twitch muscle fiber. It's a little bit more of a stabilizer. So while our gastroc might be the big, powerful, explosive muscle that works at the calves and the ankle, your soleus is a really important stabilizer, right? Like, think about me standing on a single leg, and if you do this for long enough, you'll feel your calves starting to burn. And your soleus and some of the other muscles in your ankle help to just control the position. Now, I'll also connect maybe another exercise for you guys in the gym. Maybe you guys have sat down on a seated calf raise machine before. I don't have one in here, so I'm just in this bent knee position. But where you sit down, you've got the little bar on top of the thighs, and you do calf raises that way. All right, for so long, before I really understood anatomy, I'm like, I don't know why I'm doing it in two different positions, but we're doing it. Well, the thing is when I'm in this bent knee position, it kind of takes your gastroc out of play. We mentioned before, the gastroc has a great mechanical advantage when we're here standing, but the moment I bend the knee, the gastroc doesn't have as much leverage. And so when you're doing bent knee calf raises, even as I'm here half kneeling on the ground right now, it's a great way for you to target that soleus muscle. All right, so when it comes to what we call the posterior side, the back side of the lower leg, guys, those are the only two muscles that you need to know, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. So you want to make sure you understand that slight difference of the gastroc crossing over the knee, but the soleus does not. And now we're going to move to the other side of the body. So we looked at the posterior side of our lower leg, and there are a lot of other muscles, guys, that attach down here below the knee and down into the foot. Very cool, complicated part of the body. But for where we are right now, we don't need to focus on that. We're going to come to the front side, and we will look at the tibialis anterior, or the anterior tibialis. Whoever you're talking to, they may say it in a different order, but it's the same thing. And this starts to identify our first example of antagonists. All right, antagonist-agonist relationship that works in the body. The soleus and the gastroc work more to plantar flex and then control dorsiflexion. Well, our tibialis anterior, you can kind of think of as like your shin muscle. And this may relate back to any of you guys who maybe you've ever had like shin splints. Well, this is the muscle that actually gets inflamed, because what your tibialis anterior does is it does dorsiflexion, which means that it actually pulls the toe up towards the shins. And the reason that we might oftentimes get things like shin splints is because maybe as you get out and you start running, maybe you're heel striking, maybe you're like me and you're playing basketball and there's a lot of foot contact with the ground. Well, this muscle also helps to slow down dorsiflexion, right? So slow down that plantar flexion, control the foot down to the ground. So just your common fact for trying to connect that up. But your tibialis anterior is often a very underworked muscle. I mean, it's more common now, but there's not a lot of people that are going into the gym doing these reverse calf raises. But that is an important muscle, and especially if you guys are studying the NASM material, as you get into things like the overhead squat, this is going to be one that's talked about, right? Because as we get into squatting, ankle restriction, problems here at the ankle are very, very common. And sometimes it's not only restrictions in the calves, but it may also be weakness in the other muscles like the tibialis anterior. So you guys hear it from me when it comes to muscles below the knee. As you guys are just getting started as a personal trainer or you're getting certified, these are the 3 muscles that you probably want to pay the most attention to. And they're probably the ones that you're actually going to target and work the most as well, whether it is working through mobility issues with the calves or targeting the calves with calf raises. And on the flip side, doing things to strengthen the tibialis anterior, which I can tell you is a very commonly weak muscle. It's definitely a problem area for me as well, so it's a great one to make sure that we know. And now that we've covered the muscles below the knee, which again, really just those 3, the gastroc, the soleus, and the tibialis anterior, we're gonna move above the knee. And this is where we gotta start to go from some of the terms you might be using now, like quadriceps, to the individual muscles. Quadricep 4, quad. There are 4 muscles specifically that we need to make sure that we know. Now again, as you look at this region of the body, there are a lot of individual muscles, and truthfully, there are going to be some individual muscles that we don't cover. Partially because maybe they're less directly involved with, hip flexion and knee extension and some of the joint motions that you guys are learning. But they also might be harder to target. For example, I just highlighted for you guys one of the longest muscles in the human body, the sartorius. Really cool muscle, but kind of a harder one to learn and learn what to do with. There's not a lot of exercises that just target the sartorius because of the role that it plays and stability and different motions. So I just want you guys to know that's why we're not covering them individually. And for most of your organizations, as you guys are getting certified, they really want you to focus on these primary muscles. So very cool to see how complex the body is, but good example, I'm actually gonna get rid of the sartorius on that side so we can just take a look at the quads. And as we kind of zoom in, this initial view that we see would be very similar. And guys, I really wish I had better quads for you. They're a little bit pale, but this would be more so surface level what you would see if someone had some relatively well-developed quads. And right now, we really only see these 3, right? We've got our rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, and vastus medialis. But there is a 4th one that's also hidden in there. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to get rid of our rectus femoris, one of our quad muscles, and we'll teach from deeper in first. So now as you guys look on here, we can see these 3 primary quad muscles. And the interesting part, again, you don't need to know exact origins like anatomical origin. You don't need to know the intertrochanteric line, but you should know that all 3 of the vastus muscles do not cross over the hip, right? They start on the actual femur itself, the femur being that long bone of our upper leg, and they all 3 come down and attach at a little different angles, but they all come and insert into the tibial tuberosity or the tendons that connect to our patellar tendon. So we know, that being said, it doesn't cross over the hip. We know that these 3 quad muscles, these vastus muscles we'll go through, they cannot be involved in hip motion because they don't cross over. And so it can't have that action. What all 3 muscles do though, is they do extend the knee. We think about leg extensions. This is where these quads come in. So the first one we'll see here on the outside, I have highlighted for you guys, the vastus lateralis. So this would be one that is going to be visible, lateralis, lateral to the outside of the body. And if someone has well-developed quads, it's going to help make up that kind of teardrop shape of the quadricep. So that's going to be your vastus lateralis. Now on the opposite side, you would see your vastus medialis. So we'll highlight that on here as well. That's going to be more towards what we call the midline of the body, vastus medialis. And this third one that I have highlighted here, the vastus intermedius, you won't see this one on someone physically because it sits underneath of the rectus femoris. But these 3 vastus muscles help to give us, let's call it like 3-dimensional, this kind of 360-degree control within the quads where, no matter if I'm slowing down my position in this angle or this angle or this angle, if I only had one quad that ran in one direction, I might be kind of limited. But because I have those 3, it gives me a little bit more control. But no matter what, as we look at these 3 vastus muscles, we know that when they concentrically shorten, right, muscle shortening, that they are going to extend the knee. All right, when they eccentrically lengthen, they're going to help control flexion. I just want to try to connect some of the words. If you guys haven't seen these words, you're going to be learning them at some point. Otherwise, this connects with the other stuff that you're learning. But either way, they really only work at the knee. Now, the difference between those And the one that I hid is gonna have to do with that crossover of the hip. Okay, we can see that your rectus femoris, it still does work at the knee like the rest of our quad muscles, but it actually crosses over the hip. You know, as far as the origin, the anterior, inferior, superior iliac. So if you touch this little bony portion of your hip, you have your rectus femoris starts way up here and crosses over. So not only is it going to be involved in, let's call that extension at the knee, but it's also going to be involved in hip flexion. So as we start thinking about hip flexors, your rectus femoris, one of your quad muscles, is a primary hip flexor and crosses over both. And there's only a couple of muscles that we'll talk about in the human body that work that way. The gastroc before was one of those muscles, crosses over two joints, works at the ankle, works at the knee. All right? Our rectus femoris is the next one of those, crosses over the hip and the knee. And so certain motions, it might help be a prime mover in one, maybe it's a synergistic muscle in the other, but either way we know, extension of the knee, flexion of the hip. Going into our antagonistic relationship. So that's the front side. We'll cover the other things. We're going to talk about inner and outer thigh towards the end. We're going to flip this bad boy around and look now at that antagonist relationship. So if we have muscles working on the front side for extension of the knee, well, we got muscles on the back side working for flexion of the knee. We all know these as our hamstring muscles. But just like the quads, we want to know the individual muscles themselves. So the hamstrings are actually made up of 3 muscles, and from an action standpoint, all 3 of them do similar things, and they just attach around different portions of our hips. So what I'm going to do so we have a better view here, I'm going to get rid of the glutes. And now what we'll see here is we've got these 3 hamstring muscles that I'm going to highlight. And one of them is kind of hidden there, but you guys can see these 3 hamstring muscles that we're going through back and forth. 2 of them come to the inside of the leg. 1 of them comes to the outside of the leg. Partially, if you think about it, that gives us a little bit more stability of the knee as well. But we'll start from the inside first. Let's call that medial portion of the body. And it looks like it's kind of covered up there, but the first one is our semimembranosus. Semimembranosus. Now, thankfully, this is a little easier because you got 2 that are close. You have your semimembranosus. We have our semitendinosus. And then the third one is going to be our biceps femoris, which if you think back to our quads, we had rectus femoris. Now we have biceps femoris. So as we look at these, you can see based on the origin, really where they all start, they all kind of start right here, popping up close to what we would call like the pelvic girdle. So they attach to the pelvis. So what this tells us is that the hamstring muscles, they work at the knee and the hip because they're crossing over the hip joint. So if we look at exercises and actions, no doubt it's probably easier for us to think about hamstring curls, right? Maybe you've been using a machine, a lying or a prone hamstring curl, and that's one great way of working the hamstrings. You can do stability ball hamstring curls where you're lying on the ground. So without a doubt, the hamstrings work at the knee. We would call that knee flexion. They're going to help to concentrically shorten. So from there, though, they also work at the hips. So you might think hamstring curls, but then we can also relate it to exercises like RDLs, a Romanian deadlift. So this motion here, right, they can work at the knee, but they can also work to extend the hip. So while our rectus femoris was a hip flexor, the hamstring muscles are a hip extender, all right? They can work at both. They can both do hip extension, and they can also do knee flexion. And they're all going to start in similar places, like I said, right there, up, more so on our pelvic girdle. And then they come down and they attach below and on different sides of the knee. So as I mentioned, we got kind of on that inside, we have our, our semimembranosus, then we have the semitendinosus, and then the biceps femoris. But as far as exercises go, it's going to be hard for most people to really differentiate. Some people would argue based on foot position, you might target more one than the other. But for where we are right now, just know that the hamstrings help to flex the knee and also extend the hip. And now that we've covered the quads and the hamstrings, more the front and back sides of that upper portion of our leg, now we want to look at the inner and outer thighs. The first place that we're going to go is the adductor complex. And this is one that thankfully most of the organizations like NASM don't really require you to know each individual muscle, because as we look in here, we've got the adductor magnus, we have the gracilis, we have the adductor longus, right? We get into the adductor brevis, the pectineus. There are a lot of muscles in here. But for the most part, from a function standpoint, all of these adductor muscles, these inner thigh muscles, they work to do very similar things, both with stabilization of the leg and the hip, as well as actual adduction. So for the most part, we talk about it as the adductor complex, especially if you guys are going through the NASM like we teach. So that is the nice thing. But in general, we do want to understand this is a wide variety this is a muscle group. There are many muscles that make this up. This is definitely a very important area of the body. As we look at this, this is really what connects our pelvis down into our thigh and really controls what we'll call frontal plane motion, right? Really the movement side to side of my body. Now, we might think about that from an exercise standpoint. Adductors, well, they actually help to adduct the legs. So maybe you've sat down and you've done an actual adduction machine that is common in many gyms. That would be a great way of strengthening those exercises or those muscles. But also, as we start thinking about things like lateral lunges, this is a very commonly weak area of the body, maybe tight or restricted for so many people. But just day to day, as we're moving around, what these muscles also work to do, as I lift this leg off the ground, the isometric contraction of these muscles very much prevents movement side to side. It's kind of working to prevent adduction or abduction of the hip, or really movement in the frontal plane. So this is definitely kind of an unsung hero area of the body, but the adductor complex, from an isolated function standpoint, these muscles will work to squeeze the legs together, which we call adduction. But in many ways, in many exercises, they're also helping to provide stability and control of the pelvis in relationship to the leg. So those are the adductors. And then what we'll do, and you guys can kind of see that exposed more here on one side of the image, and it sits kind of underneath of a couple of other muscles. And in the spirit of going through our agonist-antagonist relationship, these muscles that kind of work in opposition to each other, our adductors help to control and create adduction. Well, our abductors, these are our glutes. Right? And we have a couple of layers of the glutes. So I've turned our image back around to our posterior view so we can really start from the outside, and we'll take a look at the gluteus maximus, the glutes, right? The glutes that we think of. This is the big prime mover muscle. And this is an interesting one because, as you guys can see, I mentioned abduction. The glutes all work to abduct the leg, which would be to spread those legs apart from the midline. But the glutes do quite a few other things because the angle, if we see, again, you don't need to know the exact origin and insertion, but if I see where it is, I see that if those muscles shorten across that line, they can actually also externally rotate the hip. So they abduct, they externally rotate, and guess what they also do? They also extend the hip, which probably makes sense because if we start thinking about exercise we already talked about, we mentioned that the hamstrings work with hip extension. Well, the glutes also do as well because they have somewhat of this vertical fiber run. And if we think about RDLs or hip extension, right, more of a sagittal plane type motion, the glutes are definitely going to work there. So the glutes are big, big extenders of the hip, but they are also external rotators of the hip, right, bringing that hip out. That might relate to other exercises, let's say like squatting, which with an exercise like squatting, we do have, as we come up out of the bottom of that squat, we do have extension of the hip, but there's also a little bit of this external rotation that's happening. And then if you start thinking about other exercises, let's say like banded monster walks, things that you guys might have done before, that would be more of a pure abduction exercise. So your glute max, it's going to be involved in all of those. Because of the angle, it's going to be involved in a lot of motions there at the hip. And this is also, for the most part, going to be one of our big, strong, fast twitch, powerful muscles. If you're talking about running, jumping, sprinting, squatting with heavier weight, the glutes, especially the glute max, is definitely going to be involved in the exercise. So we want to make sure we have a good understanding of just that angle of the glutes. Now, if we pull those away, though, we have our glute max, but we also have a couple of other glutes, some smaller muscles that work in here as well. So I'm going to hide those, and that starts to give us a better picture of the hips. And the first one that I'm going to isolate here, you guys see, which really sits kind of just right on the outside of your pelvis, right outside of the pelvis. That's going to be your gluteus medius, or often called your glute med. This one is a little smaller muscle, and you can see, okay, it doesn't really sit on the back side of the body, so probably not really going to be involved in hip extension, but is definitely going to be more of a pure abduction muscle. Now, I mentioned before when I was talking about the adductors, right? How these things all work together. The adductors, yeah, they do adduct the hips and bring them together, but they also work to stabilize the body. And really, it's these muscles that work together. Let's say if I'm talking about running or jumping, there are moments in time when I have one leg on the ground, and the only reason my body doesn't collapse inward in that frontal plane is because we get this co-contraction. The adductors are working to stabilize as well as the glute medius, and what that does is that helps control a good position of our pelvis and our leg relative to our spine. All right, so these muscles, they definitely cause abduction, but they're also just working isometrically oftentimes to prevent motion inside the frontal plane. So that's going to be your guys' glute medius. And if we pull the glute medius away as well, what we're going to find is we will find an even smaller muscle, the gluteus minimus. So we got glute max, we have glute medius, glute minimus, easy way to remember them. All of these three are all working together to control motions at the hip, but especially your glute medius and your glute minimus, they're going to be more abduction. The other thing that you'll also see here, especially as we look at the screen, it's harder to see based on where the muscles sit, is they will also be a little bit involved in what we call medial or that, external rotation of the hip. But for the most part, stabilizer there of the hip and pelvis. So if you guys are still with me as we enter the end of this video, I know repetition is the mother of mastery, and I want to treat you guys just like I would treat our students here at the Academy, and that means going back through with a very quick recap of the muscles we went through today. I know this may take watching this video a couple of times for it to stick, but as you guys take a look at my little muscular anatomy figure here, just a reminder, there's only 3 muscles below the knee that we need to know. The first one was the gastroc. That one works at the knee and at the ankle. So it's involved in knee flexion and also plantar flexion at the ankle. In between or beneath our gastroc, we also have our soleus. That muscle, unfortunately, does not cross over the knee. So it's only going to be involved in that plantar flexion at the ankle. We also talked about the fact that it's a little bit more of a stabilizer. And as we flip over to the opposite side of the body, we have the antagonist. So we had gastroc and soleus, now the tibialis anterior. Remember, I mentioned this is the one that kind of slows your foot down as it hits the ground. Maybe you felt this when you had shin splints before, but from an action standpoint, it works to dorsiflex at the ankle. As we move above the knee, we go to our quads, which, just a reminder, we got to know more than just quadriceps. We need to know the individual muscles, and from there we actually get into our vastus muscles. We have the vastus medialis, we have the vastus intermedius, and the vastus lateralis. And as we can see, what sits over the top, that rectus femoris. And the rectus femoris is the only one that's going to be involved in hip flexion. All the others just involved in extension at the knee. As we move to the back side, we go into our hamstrings. 3 muscles, all 3 of them work to extend the hips, and they also work to flex the knee based on where they start and where they end. We have our semimembranosus, we also have our semitendinosus, and we have those biceps femoris. And as we move to that adductor area of the body, pretty complicated, but thankfully we just need to know adductor complex. All these muscles that really help to attach our pubic bone and our pelvis to the actual femur, and those are going to work to adduct or bring those legs together, or as we mentioned, also stabilize the leg. And on the opposite side of the body, to bring it home, we have our 3 glute muscles. We've got our glute max, which is going to be involved in a lot of things: hip extension, external rotation of the hips, as well as abduction. And then we have our glute medius, and then also our glute minimus, which are going to be more abductors of the hips. And I hope this video has been helpful for you guys to visualize and see this stuff. If anything, selfishly for me, it's super helpful to see these muscles where they are and to start to try to connect them to the exercises that you guys are doing in the gym. And if you want to dive in a little bit deeper on muscular anatomy and you don't already have access to our muscular anatomy guide, make sure you guys check out the link in the description below. That is a PDF for you guys to practice naming these muscles, all the muscles that we went through in this video, as well as the muscles that we'll cover in our core and our upper body videos as well.